The title of this exhibition is Scenic Impressions, Southern Interpretations from the Johnson Collection. And I thought I would organize my talk tonight around that title and deconstruct it. So first of all, who are the Johnsons and how did they get this wonderful collection? They are Susu and George Dean Johnson of Spartanburg. Actually, she's a native of Morganton, North Carolina. And unlike other private collectors, they did not make these selections themselves, but rather hired a director of the collection, Dave Henderson, who really loved to go out and find and discover things. Part of the detective work and locating lesser-known Southern artists, and in particular lesser-known women Southern artists. So we owe a lot to Dave Henderson, as well as to the Johnsons, who have funded this collection. It began about 13 years ago and now consists of about 1,300 pieces. And the premise is Southern art. It's a broad definition and broad stylistically, everything from colonial portraits up to cutting-edge yesterday's art, if you will, folk art, sculpture, prints, drawings, photographs, and scenic impressions, as we are about to talk about. So let's talk about scenic. And I think you will agree that this view of Washington from Arlington by John Ross Key is indeed a good example of scenery. It's a familiar view, though of course today it is much changed, by skyscrapers and grave markers and bridges and probably also airplanes and smog and all that comes with being a national capital. John Ross Key, our painter here, grew up in this area as a child. In fact, he lived with his grandfather, whose name you probably will recognize, Francis Scott Key. So that puts him into an historical context. After his childhood, he spent a period of time as a cartographer. He was assigned thus to Charleston Harbor during the Civil War, and from that experience did a number of absolutely smashing paintings. And then he had some years of itinerancy, going to Boston, Chicago, California, going abroad, and then returned to Washington in the early years of the 20th century. This is, in my view, kind of an iconic view. It shows these great monuments that we all associate with the national capital. It is pastoral, it is pleasing, it is indeed, I think, very scenic. A view, if you will, of the built environment of yesteryear. Another urban scene is one I hope you recognize a little bit. This is your Cathedral of St. John the Baptist by William Chadwick. William Chadwick actually was in Savannah a number of winters. He was invited to teach for the Savannah Art Association in not this building, but the one next door. And I had the pleasure earlier this morning to go up into the studio space with this beautiful northern window. And I could just picture Chadwick painting there with winter light pouring in. And so I think what we see here also is winter light, this bright sunshine that bathes the Gothic towers of the cathedral. This is, of course, an atypical view. Most people who render cathedrals or take photographs of them portray the facade, the front door. But for some reason, Chadwick wandered around the side, and I think the end result is quite remarkable with its juxtaposition of the high-style Gothic towers and the vernacular rectangular structure down below. And of course, he's added some local color with the African-American figure of the scale of the cathedral, which I think is very important. So we have here, with the John Ross Key and the Chadwick, two urban views that I think are very scenic. In addition, in the exhibition, there are views of mountains, several rather beautiful mountains. A lot of people down on the coast might forget that we are very lucky to have such things as Pisgah National Forest, the Smoky Mountains. I've been hiking lately, and so I've gotten to know them and have developed a new passion. Lawrence Matsonovitch, a wonderful tongue-twisting name. He was known by his friends as Mazzy, M-A-Z-Z-Y. He had a very successful career based in Westport, Connecticut, which was not so far from New York City, so he could get down to visit the galleries, visit his dealer, maybe go to a museum exhibition, and enjoy some collegiality with fellow painters. Well, this was all well and good until about 1923, when it seems he kind of got fed up with the rat race of New York, I guess, of the pressures of being a successful painter, and maybe also the pressures that he was experiencing from his wife, who we know, we're pretty sure, kept pushing him in order to make money. So he gave this lifestyle up and retreated to Tryon, North Carolina, to the mountains, a lovely setting, and spent the last 36 years of his life there painting the mountains, such as you see here, the Smoky Mountains, and this wonderful square format painting, which is very unusual for a landscape, but I think it allows him to kind of compress the perspective, so it's kind of layered rather than one that is perspectival. So we have the mountains, and we also have the sea. The sea is seen in this wonderful watercolor by Alice Ravenel Huger Smith of Charleston. She was a proficient watercolorist. She had a few lessons as a young girl, sometime in her teens, but that was pretty much the extent of her education. She did benefit from the study of Japanese prints, and I'll be showing another watercolor later on in which you will see that influence. But I think in this painting in particular, the liquid nature of the watercolor works so beautifully with the kind of liquid image, the mist that she is depicting, and of course the water and its reflections. So 4 examples of scenery. So the second word in the title is impressions, not impressionism, though obviously there is some connection, and there are some very fine examples of impressionism in the exhibition, though there are also some very exceptional paintings which we cannot by any means call examples of impressionism. There were 2 women artists, however, who I think we can label as impressionists. On the left, Willy Betty Newman, and on the right, Blondell Malone. They both have these fascinating first names. Willy Betty was actually named for her father, William Betty. So Betty is actually her maiden name, not her middle name, as it were. So Willy Betty Newman was married in her teens to Mr. Newman, hence the name change. They had a son, but then she decided that she really wanted to be an artist. And so she took off for Cincinnati, this is from her base in Tennessee, to study art at the Cincinnati Art Academy, a distinguished institution at the time. And after that, she spent a decade in France. She attended the Académie Julienne, which was the to-go place for many aspiring American artists. They welcomed American artists. American artists, students, was sort of an industry there. And of course, it was not just the schools, but it was the cafes, the boarding houses, everything. And it just so happened that at the Académie Julienne, women were welcomed, although their tuition was twice that of the male students. This is a rather small painting, thus I think it's entirely possible we could call it a plein air painting, which is a word we use with Impressionism in terms of something painted out of doors. And I think you might also recognize her motif of the French poplars. Those are the trees that were kind of memorialized or celebrated by Claude Monet. And it's not out of the question that she would have seen some of his paintings when she was there in the early years of the 20th century. But our other artist, Blondell Malone, had a much closer relationship to Claude Monet, and she is often described as a spirited redhead. She was very independent, and she made this incredible statement. In contrast to Newman, who did get married but then abandoned her husband and child, Blondell Malone said, "The more I see of married life, the gladder I am that I am single. For the minute a girl is married, she gets in a rut and never advances an inch." So that's Blondell. Blondell had a good deal of gumption. She developed a correspondence with Mary Cassatt, who recommended that she not live out her life in Paris, but to seek her fortune elsewhere. And Malone also wrote to Claude Monet asking for an audience. At this time, Monet was very reluctant to give American artists the time of day, even though there was that community of American artists painting in Giverny. You have a wonderful example, I guess, downstairs of Frederick Frieseke, and of course he was part of that circle. But somehow, maybe using her lovely name, her ability to speak French, Blondell did get an audience with Monet, and they got along famously. Like Monet, Malone was a painter of gardens and was often called the garden painter of America. Now, gardens, as you know, are very much a favored subject of American Impressionists, European Impressionists as well, and here we have the Gary Melchers from this collection. The woman in this instance is, of course, his wife, and there's a sense of domesticity, and of course this is full-fledged Impressionism. So this is the third example of Impressionism, just to illustrate. The exhibition has more than landscapes. There's some wonderful depictions of women out of doors, like Mrs. Melchers in her garden. This is a painting by Helen Turner called Summer Song. Turner often chose her depictions of women out of doors doing something, playing the piano, sewing, or arranging a Japanese lantern. So this, I think, is a fine example of American Impressionism. You need to appreciate its texture, which you cannot do through reproductions. There's lots of impasto, which of course she is using to create the sense of dappled light. So there's a sense of feminine gentility. Turner grew up in New Orleans. She aspired to be an artist. Her family was somewhat impoverished following the Civil War, and so she worked as a teacher for years in order to fund her art education. And it wasn't until she was 37 that she got to New York to study at the Art Students League, and she became a student of William Merritt Chase. And there is a theme throughout this exhibition of the role that Chase played, the role the Académie Julienne played, in terms of fostering these many artists. She, in fact, went abroad with Chase on several of his study abroad sessions. In turn, she taught. She didn't teach at a distinguished institution, but at the local YWCA, where her students were women artists, aspiring women artists, who were largely destined to be illustrators, to illustrate fashion magazines, children's book illustrations, that sort of thing. But it paved the way for Turner, who had a good deal of success in her own right. She was the 4th woman to be admitted to the Distinguished National Academy of Design. She was granted the rank of academician. So I think that is to her credit. In much the same manner, Anna Catherine Wiley, Lady with Parasol, has the same sense of dappled light. This is brighter in terms of its palette, a lot more white, of course, and yet it still has that sense of feminine domesticity, this kind of delicate portrayal. Catherine Wiley may, in this case, be using as her model one of her students. She taught at the University of Tennessee, her alma mater. She attended the university there just after it became co-ed. And by the way, when she was teaching in the home economics department, which I find to be somewhat amusing. Like Turner and others, she did go to the Art Students League for a period of time, and she too studied with William Merritt Chase. And if you look at William Merritt Chase's biography, or you study him, you'll find that his greatest following was among women artists. He had a knack for not only tolerating them, but nurturing them, encouraging them, and of course, in return, they provided him with a very fine income. Okay, so that's scenic and impressions. So our next two words are Southern interpretations, and here things get a little more complicated. So we have in this category Southerners, people such as Hattie Saucy, a native daughter born right here in Savannah, represented with this lovely path with mossy trees. And I think you should feel very proud of the fact that she is the artist that graces the cover of the accompanying book. She too, like the others, was New York educated. She went to the National Academy, she went to the Art Students League, she traveled in Europe. But you should also feel very proud of the fact that in the 1920s, she returned Savannah, and this is where she made her mark as an artist and also as a co-founder of the Savannah Art Association. She clearly understood and appreciated what is almost a spiritual and mystical in her hands sense of the Southern landscape, and the way she paints the light, the way she handles the Spanish moss and the very rich vegetation. I'd like to compare her to her Charleston counterpart, who you've already seen, Alice Smith, again a watercolor, and this is the one that I think you can agree is very Japanesque in its sensibility, its shape, its vertical shape, its coloration, its reverence for nature, because this is what she studied. Now, unlike Hattie Saucy, Alice Smith could not afford to go to New York to study or go to Europe. And she, later on in the 1950s, when she was in her 70s, she wrote her reminiscences, which are a wonderful evocation of life in Charleston in the late 19th and early 20th century. And she explained her situation in the following words. Circumstances beyond my control prevented me from going to a large city where art schools and galleries might help the traveler on his way. And so I reasoned to myself that I could not see the great art of the great cities. I might follow the old fable of the men who dug in their fields for treasure, but not finding it, they made wonderful crops of their spaded land. So I knew that my own lovely flat country of rice fields, of pine woods, of cypress swamps, of oaks and lotus and all their attendant feathered folk would yield me a full harvest if diligently spaded. She worked very hard and I think was successful in terms of creating a body of work that really shows that she mined her own circumstance. Alice Smith became very much a force in this phenomena that we call the Charleston Renaissance, which was that period of renewal in Charleston in basically the 1920s and the 1930s. She wrote first about the architecture of Charleston, painted paintings such as these, which appealed to the growing number of tourists who were coming to town. So we look at the Charleston Renaissance as not only a renaissance of the artists, the writers, but also a revival of the city's economy, and also the birth of the tourist industry, which could be a mixed blessing, but it's certainly the lifeblood of Charleston. A true son of the South was Elliot Dangerfield. He was born in Harper's Ferry. His father was working for the Confederacy. They moved to Fayetteville, North Carolina, and then finally Dangerfield ended up spending a good deal of his late career in Blowing Rock, North Carolina. He became a noted New York city-centered artist. He had a studio among other artists and was very much influenced by the art of George Inness. And I don't know if you're familiar with his work, but Inness was known for layering his varnishes. So there are layers of color, layers of varnish, which create a kind of overall tonality, an earthy tonality. It is also clearly a major headache for conservators, all those layers of varnish. In fact, there is a kind of Barbizon-like aesthetic to the landscapes of Elliot Dangerfield. And by Barbizon, I'm referring to that French school of painters, painting beginning in the 1830s and 1840s, who discovered the peasant life, the rural atmosphere of Barbizon. They also loved the cheap accommodations and the cheap food and the cheap wine of Barbizon. So that's sort of the aesthetic of Dangerfield. And another artist who is specifically associated with Barbizon is G. Bridger Donahoe. His connection with the South is legitimate, but very short-lived. He was born in Mississippi, but as a young child, and I'm talking 3 or 4 years old, he was moved to Washington. This is at the time of the Civil War, and he kept moving. So his connections with the South are somewhat tangential, but legitimate. He spent 7 years in Paris. He studied at the Académie Julienne during that time and spent a good deal of time at Barbizon. He had large paintings which he submitted to the Paris Salon successfully. They were very much of that aesthetic. In the 1890s, he returned to this country. He got involved in the New York world, but it was not to his liking after his experience abroad. And so he discovered East Hampton on Long Island, the very end of Long Island, which had a kind of quaint, old world quality. It still has windmills, the remnants of windmills. And as you can see in this painting of the plowman, a very pastoral farming scene, complete with haystacks that, of course, remind us of none other than Claude Monet. So Donahoe, born in Mississippi, but choosing to pursue a kind of an American Barbizon, if you will, on the eastern end of Long Island. Dixie Selden, another artist with significant southern contacts. Actually, she kind of bridges the Ohio River there between Covington, Kentucky, and Cincinnati, spending parts of her life on either side. And it seems that her lifestyle was arranged around the seasons, so that in the wintertime she was in the Cincinnati area painting portraits of businessmen and society women, and she did very well. She was actually a student of Frank Duveneck, who was a significant artist associated with the Munich school and teaching at the Cincinnati Art Academy. She became very much a protege of his. But in 1913, she had a summer course with William Merritt Chase in Venice, and this seems to have been something of a turning point because as a genteel Southern woman, she did not feel comfortable sitting en plein air in the middle of a landscape or near a harbor painting. But he persuaded her that it was acceptable, that she could just concentrate on her work, that she was not being a voyeur. Now, these are artists, native artists who've gone abroad, Donahoe, Dixie Selden, Hattie Saucy, and there were also many artists who came to the South for a variety of reasons. And I think that they were interested in the South through a variety of vehicles. Word of mouth. The art world was a lot smaller then, and you've already heard of kind of the networks, the Académie Julienne, William Merritt Chase. Charles Hassan would have been another individual who would have encouraged people in his circle to come south. Art Students League, colonies, I haven't mentioned art colonies such as Old Lyme in Connecticut, where Hassan was a major player, but also William Chadwick. So you get the sense that they would have talked this up. And also one of the other realities is during this time, the press, magazines, newspapers began to write about the South and its charms. That's certainly true of Charleston. And Charleston was enhanced by such things as Porgy and Porgy, which became Porgy and Bess, which appeared in Broadway in 1925. The dance, the Charleston, that kind of put Charleston on people's minds. So lots of things, I think, generated an interest in the South. Now this artist, George Ade, and this is not a Southern painting by any means, and it has a French title, so that's why I've got it, The Winter in Fontainebleau. This is a full-fledged Barbizon-style painting painted in the Barbizon area of Fontainebleau. At one time, in fact, Barbizon was described as savage in scenery. And I think what's interesting, at the time that George Ade was painting these sorts of paintings in the 1890s, 1900, 1910, the Barbizon style was very, very popular among American collectors. So much so that the likes of the great Hudson River School painters, Frederick Edwin Church and Albert Bierstadt, their reputations went into the cellar because people were turning to France and enjoying images and collecting and buying images of the Barbizon school. In the 1920s, George Ade moved to Tryon alongside of Lawrence Matsonovitch. He did go happily with his wife, who I think was very devoted to him. So we find that becomes sort of an artist colony, not unlike the colony in Old Lyme, Connecticut. And so he becomes a transplant, if you will. Another transplant of a sort was Alfred Hattie, who was a kind of seasonal transplant, if you will, because he would split his year. He would spend the summer in Woodstock, New York, and the winter in Charleston. His raison d'etre for going to Charleston at first was to teach at the Carolina Art Association, which is the mother organization of the Gibbes Art Gallery, the Gibbes Museum of Art. And there was a legend, which I love, but I think it's been disproven, but I love it anyway, so I'll share it with you. Apparently, when he arrived in Charleston on the train, he immediately wired his wife and said, "Come quickly, have found heaven." Lovely. So from about 1920-21 until his death in 1954, Alfred Hattie was a winter resident of Charleston. And he joined Alice Smith as a major figure of the Charleston Renaissance. In fact, he was the outsider and the male behind the Charleston Renaissance. The other artists tended to be native and South Carolinians, which is kind of an interesting phenomena, but that's another story. You're not here to hear that one. So Hattie, I mentioned, was a teacher. We've already seen that Chadwick came here to Savannah to teach, and the year that he was here, 1924 through 1927, in 1924-25, he was joined by Elliot Clark. And I am revisiting the Chadwick painting because obviously there is a huge stylistic difference between these two artists, teaching at the same time. And I know that one of the reasons why Savannah was so attractive, first of all, there was the climate, attractive climate in the wintertime, but also the presence of a viable academy with a collection established by Carl Brandt, by Gary Melchers. I mean, they had a laboratory, unlike many places in this country. So I'm sure that in the eyes of Chadwick and Elliot Clark, Savannah was a very special destination. So in any event, Elliot Clark's view of Savannah is one of what we call tonalism. Tonalism is a kind of variation, if you will, or a category in its own right of a painting style in which the overall tone dominates. And the tone tends to dissolve forms and edges. There's a softness, there's an atmospheric quality. And this is what appealed to Elliot Clark. And he describes, and I must say, when I woke up this morning, looked out the window of the Westin and saw the fog, I thought, aha, Elliot Clark. Except it was morning light. But this is what he said about being in Savannah in the wintertime. The evening light was particularly beautiful. I made a number of pictures in different light and aspects of the harbor. The winter in Savannah was mild and pleasant, and what impressed me as a painter was the soft, enveloping, atmospheric light, quite different from the contours and strong shadows of New England. This sylvan light formed the background of the Savannah mood. And I was so pleased when I arrived yesterday and could see the two Elliot Clarks in the Telfair collection hanging in the hallway. And you can see again, these are examples of this kind of misty, tonalistic, atmospheric approach. The other thing that Clark, especially in the upper left there, did not shy away from is showing the industrial side of the city, that this was a working waterfront. And I've been enjoying that experience myself as well, so there's been some nice empathy between the two of us. So we've been talking about teachers, Alfred Hattie, Chadwick, Elliot Clark coming to the South. There are two other figures that are in the exhibition that were major forces in terms of art education. They are James Herring on the left and Ellsworth Woodward on the right. James Herring actually was born in a small town in South Carolina. He managed to get a degree in art pedagogy at Syracuse University, but his real accomplishment was going to Howard University in Washington. That's one of the great African-American historic universities, where he established the art department. And so he became a real force for art education there. And in addition to administering an art department, he established an art gallery with a collection not limited to African-American art, but global representation, as well as white contemporary artists. And in addition, he had his own commercial gallery in his row house in Washington, the Barnett Aden collection, where he would exhibit the work of African-American artists as well as white artists. So he was sort of a, if you will, and I don't think this is too much of a stretch, a sort of Alfred Stieglitz for racial art, where Stieglitz was doing between European and American. And so with all of these activities, I think you can imagine that Herring had a busy life, and so his oeuvre, the number of paintings that he produced, was very limited. So we're very fortunate to have this small landscape in the Johnson collection, and once again was painted on a board, something called Academy board, which is a pre-prepared board, which would be easy to take down to the beach where he could paint this very openly brushed landscape. And this is not a good reproduction. The other artist, Ellsworth Woodward, was a force for education and also a force for Southern art, despite the fact that he himself was a Yankee. He arrived in New Orleans and was affiliated with Tulane University, but quickly moved to founding the Newcomb College Art Department. And that is a very significant place for art education especially of women, and the agenda there with the curriculum was to teach the women practical ways to support themselves. So such curricular activities included bookbinding, jewelry, textile design, and you probably also recognize pottery, because Newcomb pottery is a distinguished and kind of a special style unto itself. So this was all under the tutelage of Ellsworth Woodward. Like Herring, he was a busy guy. For a period, I think, of 14 years, he was the director of the Isaac Delgado Museum, which you may know today better as the New Orleans Museum of Art. He was also very active in the Southern States Art League, which was a membership organization beginning about 1921, which circulated exhibitions, juried exhibitions of the members, and there were something like 1,300 members at one point. There was a major exhibition, and then from that there was a traveling exhibition that was, circulated to smaller venues around the South. And Woodward became, as president, a real champion of Southern art, though he realized that as a resident of the South, even for 40, 50 years, he was lacking. And just like Herring, kind of very few paintings, we find that Ellsworth Woodward probably painted this New England scene while on vacation. In the summertime, he often went back to Massachusetts, his roots, and that's probably the origin of this painting. In any event, he said about being a Yankee based in New Orleans, "No Yankee artist, however skillful, can paint the South. He has never known the sights and sounds and smells in his childhood. I have spent 50 years in the South, and when I make annual pilgrimage to various parts of the South, I think the masterpieces I could paint if only I were a Southerner born." So there's a little bit of regret. So in addition to these artists who transplanted themselves and were teaching in the South, there were artists who were seasonal visitors, such as Vert Harrison, who was associated with the landscape program of the Art Students League, which took place in Woodstock, New York. He was also an author about landscape painting. He has the same tonalist approach as Elliot Clark, that same kind of overall tone. And I might point out that this is a pastel. It's the only pastel in the exhibition. It's absolutely beautiful. It's large scale. And there is a reason why it's a pastel. During the mid-teens, Harrison had developed an allergy to lead paint, basically lead poisoning. So he had to avoid working in oil, and so he took up pastel instead. And this wonderful sunburst is a result. It was he who recommended that Alfred Huddie go to Charleston, and during his winters, Harrison's winters in Charleston, he was a mentor of a sort to Alice Smith. So it's very nice what Courtney has done hanging them together. Another artist, this was a Chicago-based artist, Rudolf Engel II, loved the mountains. He painted in the Ozarks and then discovered the Smoky Mountains. And he became a regular, consistent visitor to the Smokies. This would have been in the 1920s and 1930s. He would take his paintings and sketches back to Chicago where they were exhibited. He wrote about his experiences in the Smokies, and he actually took some credit for contributing and fueling the momentum to make the Smokies a national park, which it became in 1934. So here you have two examples of his work. Actually, the one on the right is not upstairs, but this wonderful painting on the left of this cabin scene and this visitor and these gorgeous Fraser magnolia trees, which in all their glory. Another visitor who will intrigue you because he came here in 1914, Harry Hoffman. We have been debating where this was painting. Our Harry here, Harry Delorme, is convinced this is Jones Street. I can accept that, of course. There is some discussion as to whether this was painted in the summer or the winter. I lean to the winter because of the quality of the light and the shadow, and also because of the fairly heavy cloaks that the street sweepers are wearing. In any event, he not only captures the brilliant color of the buildings, the vernacular buildings, but also the local color of the people at work. The women carrying the vegetables, the laundry on their head, the vendor with his cart. There's a sense of activity, and I think really a magnificent painting. It really belongs here, don't you think? Yes. Another artist, and I would call Hoffman and also this artist, Colin Cooper, travelers, or what has been called birds of passage, meaning they flew in and then flew out. So birds of passage. Both Hoffman and Colin Cooper were inveterate travelers. Cooper had been in Europe in the 1890s. We believe that he would have seen Monet's paintings of Rouen Cathedral. He proceeded to do a series of English cathedrals, Wells, Salisbury, York, Durham. And then when he returned to the States, he settled in New York, where there are very few cathedrals, and he took up instead painting skyscrapers, which of course, if you think of the early skyscrapers from the first and second decades of the 20th century, many of them had Gothic details, finials at the top, and it's often been said that America's cathedrals are her skyscrapers. So he comes to Charleston in 1913, a quaint, and I think I have the wrong date up here. Oh no, it's good. He comes to Charleston in 1913, where, of course, there were no skyscrapers, but he discovered the wonderful old quaintness of Charleston and St. Philip's, which he has painted from the cemetery across Church Street. This is a small gouache, and I think you can sense the rapidity with which he actually painted this as if he was painting on site. And another artist who I would call a bird of passage, though he passed through here on several occasions, as a guest of Sarah Livingston at her house on the outskirts of Savannah. He had a very strong European background. He was exceptional because he was accepted after several applications, I might add, into the distinguished École des Beaux-Arts, which was the French art school, where the French academicians studied Renaissance art, classical casts, live models. And this was a good foundation for William de Leftwich Dodge for his major work, which was mural painting. And in terms, if you think of murals from the Renaissance, you think of Michelangelo. So his foundation at the École des Beaux-Arts served him well in his murals, which he did for the World's Columbian Exposition in 1893, the Library of Congress, Albany State Capitol, and you should think spaces such as this, large dome spaces where the vista is very broad, and of course the figures, for the most part, would have been allegorical. So when you see this painting, you should not be surprised at her scale. She's larger than life, which I think of in terms of, he's used to people looking way up in the distance, and also this wonderful open brushwork, which of course we can read from a distance because it is so incredibly bold. There are also wonderful passages that are virtually abstract there in the upper left, and then in her bundle of sheets that she characterizes. I think if I could go back to those, and they're hung in the same room, so you can see that upstairs, to the genteel depictions by Helen Turner of the woman playing the guitar, Catherine Wiley, the woman with the parasol. They are not looking at us. They are disengaged, where this woman, this muscular woman, looks us directly in the eye. So, speaking of upstairs, I hope that you will join me up there. So I know you have a major decision to make because there's going to be a lovely reception downstairs. So it's a tough one, but I won't be offended if you want to do a little eating and drinking, but I hope you will get upstairs eventually. And I hope you have some questions. We have a few minutes, I believe. Questions? Oh, come now. Yes?
And I don't know if I'm pronouncing her name correctly, Augusta
Olschig? Olschig?
Is she too late to be in this group?
Okay.
Because she's
right.
in the southern
the question is Augusta Olschig represented in this exhibition? She is not, and off the top of my head, I have a couple of possible explanations. The Johnson collection didn't have the goods. They didn't own an appropriate painting by her. And also I think of her, and Courtney, others you could correct me, I think of her as more a genre painter, a figure painter, not with the same sort of impressionist sensibility. So that's a vague explanation. You have some wonderful examples of her work, and I saw the sketch at the Jepson for the painting that is downstairs, which is kind of a fun connection. Any other? Yes?
I'm curious about the Johnson collection and their approach to putting their collection together. Seems a little bit disengaged. That they would hire someone, because the hunt is part of the interest.
Right, right. The question is, she's puzzled by the lack of engagement by the Johnsons, and the comment was that the hunt is part of the fun of forming a collection. I agree, but this collection was formed on a large scale, and I don't want to give the impression that the Johnsons have not been interested. They have followed all of, Dave would present most of the acquisitions to them after he'd bought them, of course. And they do have some very nice examples in their collection, in their house. So they live with a selection of the artwork. The collection is housed in the Johnson Development Building, which is basically an office building. And so the paintings are hung in the lobby and throughout the offices. So they're, when George Dean goes, walks down the hall, he sees things, and there are things in the conference room. So they're there, but I guess they had other things to do. I don't know. Well, if you're too shy to ask questions in this forum, I understand, and I'm happy to entertain them upstairs. So thank you for coming, and enjoy Scenic Impressions.